Judges watch how you behave. Many times clients are really focused on what was said in court. When I debrief with a client after the fact, a lot of times what I hear is, well, the other attorney said this, my attorney said that, my attorney didn't say this, I wanted them to, the other person said this, I said that, here's what the judge said. It's all about what everybody said. That's not really most of the time the part that the judge is focused on, actually. And I'm going to tell you what they're focused on. But before I do, let me just remind you, as always, if you like the content, you find it helpful, don't forget to hit like on this video. Also subscribe to the channel so that you get notified as new videos are released. The judge isn't looking at what's said. What are they looking at? They're looking at how you behave. They're looking at how you behave. They're looking at how your ex behaves. If your behavior outside of the courtroom runs completely contradictory to what's being said when you're in the courtroom, then those two things don't match up for the court, right? And the court goes, okay, there's a problem here because they're saying this thing, but then they're doing this thing, and these two things don't align. So something's wrong. Either they're not actually doing what they're saying they're doing, their perception of what they're doing is incorrect, or something. Because if you go in and you're like, oh yeah, I'm very supportive of the other person and all these things, but then the other person comes in and goes, okay, well, here's these 3 incidences that all show that they don't support, the other parent doesn't support my parenting, then the court's like, okay, well, if you're saying you do support the other person's parenting, why are you doing these things, right? Again, it just doesn't add up. And so the court is really more reliant, I think, most of the time on the behaviors and what's being said. And I remember, a judge one time at the end of a trial that I watched saying, I'm looking, does the story hold together? Is it what a reasonable person would do? Does it make sense? If it doesn't make sense, then the court generally starts to not believe what that person's saying. And I think that we get really focused on that because when the person says something that's like, it's not true, or we know it didn't happen that way or whatever, we kind of automatically assume that the court factored that in if we didn't get the result we wanted. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they did, because it just means that, the court usually sits up there and they don't give commentary. They don't sit up there and go, well, you're a real jerk. They don't do that. They're a neutral, right? So they're quiet. They take it all in, and then they just go, okay, here's what we're going to do. And they don't comment on whether you were a jerk for doing that or you weren't or whatever. I think that, when we're talking about our behaviors, those can really give you a lot of leverage. And when your behaviors do line up with what you're saying, this is the point where you gain a lot of credibility in the court's eyes. And I talk about credibility as everything, because if you start to develop credibility with the judge, then you get to the point where everything you say becomes believable, because the court knows you as having that integrity, as being a truth teller, as doing what you say you're going to do. And when they start to understand that that's your pattern of behavior across the board in your case, then they're going to start to believe the words that are coming out of your mouth. And that credibility can help you so much in the context of your case. I'll give you an example. I had a client recently where the court actually looked at their parenting app messages and commented about how reasonable my client was in their responses to the other person, even though the other parent was completely attacking, always just, insulting them, demanding things, dictating how the parenting schedule was going to go because they didn't have court orders yet, and all those types of behaviors. And my client, because they're my client, right? And they're getting coached on how to do this. They were like, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. Here's the issue. Are you willing to do this, or this? And a lot of times the other person would say no. And my client would get so frustrated and be like, they won't agree no matter what I do. And I kept saying, just let them do that. Let them keep, shutting you down and keep doing those things. And in the meantime, there was a young child that was caught in the crosshairs of all this behavior. And it was really, really hard for this parent to do that. But over the long haul, it paid off because that judge actually saw, wow, this parent's being very reasonable, even in light of all these attacks from the other parent and all this kind of stuff. And then what happens is the court goes, oh, well, you're a reasonable person and you support the other person's parenting, and you're more likely to try to cooperate with the other parent and keep them involved. So guess what? I'm going to give you more power and control in this situation. And this particular client got tie-breaking authority in legal custody, which was a huge thing. And it's because they trusted my client to keep the other parent involved on those decisions and informed and all that kind of stuff. Whereas they said, if we give this to the other parent, and I think there was an attorney for the child involved, and they said, if we give this to the other parent, they're going to just totally cut the other parent out. They're not going to share any information. They're already demanding and dictating and doing all those things. And they're just not going to include the parent in that way. And, there was arguments over all kinds of little things like that. But my client was consistent in the way that they communicated. And this went on, actually the hearing got delayed a couple of times. And this went on for several months, like 7, 8, 9 months that my client was dealing with this situation. And that can be really frustrating. And we had more than one tear-filled conversation about it, right? Because you are kind of caught in the crosshairs in the meantime. But then when you actually get to that point, and then the court says, wow, we trust you because we see the communication, and people will say to me, like, is the communication in and of itself going to give me leverage? No, not by itself. Like it's a comprehensive strategy. But when you have somebody on the other side that is behaving poorly in multiple ways, and then you on your side are behaving well in multiple ways, well, that starts to gain you more and more leverage with the court. And so I always say to people, like, look, try to do your communication right from the start. Like, keep a clean slate in that parenting app. Like, try to do it as best as you can possibly do it. I do a lot of coaching around communication, so it is a critical piece of it. And it's the piece of it, frankly, that causes people the vast majority of the stress, because it's the daily thing, right? That comes up over and over and over, where you're trying to communicate with this other parent on all the different moving parts of raising children. So it does become a big stress factor. And I think that's why it becomes easy to react. But if you can keep your side of the street clean, so to speak, from the very beginning, it gives you a huge advantage. And you know what? If you haven't kept it clean from the very beginning, that's okay. We're human. We make mistakes. Courts realize that. Breakups are emotional. All of those things. The court gives you grace for those types of things. But what I always say is, the sooner you start turning it around, the better, right? You need to start shifting that as quickly as you can, because if you're seen as engaging in that negative behavior, then you go into court and you have no leverage, because it's like, are they a jerk? Sure, but your behavior isn't great either. And you just don't get leverage out of that. It's like, oh, I got 2 jerks on my hands. Well, that's pretty much what the court sees all day, every day. So again, painting that contrast between your behavior and the other person's behavior by just sucking it up. And to quote my late husband, wear your halo. That's really where the secret lies. If you'd like more help with this kind of stuff, you can go to divorceuniversityonline.com. There's information on that page on my group coaching programs for moms and for dads. There's also information on my high-level premium one-on-one VIP coaching services. If you have a more complex case, you just want more hands-on help, you're at the very beginning, whatever the case may be, if that's something you're interested in, you can find that there also. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you guys next time. We'll grow in number,